Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. The fired Atlanta police officer who shot and killed Rayshard Brooks has been charged with felony murder. The other responding officer has been charged with assault. The Fulton County District Attorney announcing the charge of murder and several other charges against fired Officer Garrett Rolfe this afternoon. The other responding officer, Devin Brosnan, has been placed on administrative duty and has agreed to serve as state's witness. Here's more from DA Paul Howard.
The whole casual conversation, the fact that they patted him down, he had no weapon, even the body language between the officers and Mr. Brooks, it was very casual, very informal. Nothing seemed to happen that would indicate that he was of some danger. But you're right, at the critical point of the shooting, what the evidence shows that he was some 18 feet, 3 inches away. His back was turned, and I believe a reasonable person would conclude that he was not an immediate threat at that time.
The shooting prompted Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms to call Brooks' death a murder and led to the resignation of the city's police chief. For more on this, I'm joined by Reverend James Major Woodall. He is the president of the NAACP in Georgia. Reverend Woodall, thanks very much for being with us. What are your thoughts on the DA deciding to press charges in this case? Do you think that this will result in any reform in the Atlanta Police Department?
Well, thank you for having me. And, we are, excited, or not excited, but rather grateful that the district attorney did his job and held this officer accountable with felony murder charges, aggravated assault, and a host of several others. But we have seen these kinds of things happen where, even though there are charges brought forth, that there is not a conviction. And so the necessary reforms will take its course, that we will continue to press forward and ensure that these kinds of things don't happen again, because what we have is a law enforcement officer who not only stood on top of a dead man's body, but kicked it as well. An officer. And I don't know what kind of training, I don't know what kind of policy that would actually change that from happening. We have law enforcement that are more concerned with parading around dead people than, the elected officials actually doing something about it. And I think that's troubling for us.
Well, the Georgia NAACP led a protest to the state capitol earlier this week as lawmakers resumed the 2020 session. The demonstrators were calling for a range of issues from voter rights to police reform. What kind of legislative change are you hoping for?
We're hoping for systematic changes that will lead to a situation where no one else has to die. Right now, they're currently having conversations about hate crimes, and the lieutenant governor put out a statement about his version of the bill that would ultimately protect neo-Nazis and Klan members more than it would protect Black people. And so we have legislative leadership that is not willing to actually deal with the problems of white supremacy and dehumanizing violence. We have to talk deeply and honestly about repealing citizens' arrest, repealing the use of force, the duty to retreat provision. And if we're talking about hate crime and talking about protecting neo-Nazis and white supremacists, we still have a situation on our hands where more Black people are going to end up dead. We've gotten calls every single day. Every single day, another person is shot dead or murdered, lynched because of inaction by our leadership. And so we're demanding that the General Assembly do its job, or we will come and shut it down.
Reverend, going back to the charges against the officers, I want to ask you about something that the district attorney himself pointed out that was notable in his view regarding this case, and that is that the other officer involved in that encounter with Mr. Brooks is now a cooperating state's witness. He noted that that was pretty unusual in cases like this. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Does that symbolize or represent to you any kind of perhaps beginning of a change?
Well, it's quite honestly, it's not about me and how I feel about it. It's about making sure that officer does not get back on the streets, because we have way too many times where officers, because for instance, this officer was accused of covering up another murder a few years ago. And so this is a challenging time for us because we continue to see the level of dehumanizing violence against our communities and nothing ever happens. And so as while this is one individual case, what I'm concerned about is the glaring and deep, really problematic culture that we continue to see perpetuated in our communities all over this state.
I want to turn to what's happening in Washington. On Wednesday, Senate Republicans unveiled their plans for police reform. They include additional training and would limit but not ban the use of chokeholds. It's similar to the executive order signed by the president yesterday. What is your view of these plans? Do they go far enough, or is this a starting point?
I think it's neither. I think it's an insult to injury that the president nor has, the Senate Republicans actually talk to those in the communities on the ground. They'd rather talk to unions and people that are sitting in very fancy offices like mine than actually going into the streets of their communities and talking to people, because the people have demands. What they put forth is not anywhere near what those on the ground, those who are being literally tear gassed in the streets every time they go out there, being shot with rubber pellets and bullets, they're not asking for piecemeal solutions. They're asking for systematic changes so that they can stop dying. They can stop mourning. They can stop losing people's lives. That's what they're asking for. They're not asking for small and minor changes. They want the whole system to change.
Finally, Reverend, I want to get your take on Georgia's state primary last week. A record number of absentee ballots are still being counted. Voters had to deal with hours-long waits, undertrained and understaffed poll workers, and allegations of disenfranchisement. Are you confident that these issues will be resolved in time for the November election? I'm
hopeful that the Secretary of State will work with organizations like the Georgia NAACP and many others who we work with on a day-to-day basis to make our elections secure and safe. We have been working on this issue for the past year and a half to ensure that Georgia's elections did not end up this way. And unfortunately, those recommendations fell on deaf ears. We wanted to expand early voting. We wanted to see the absentee ballot process made more easier so that it can be more accessible to people all over this state. Unfortunately, we were more interested in spending $150 million plus on new machines that were actually not as secure as they were promoted and publicized about. And so what we saw was not only was there confusion, there was mass hysteria, and we saw lines that were so long that people were out there 4 and 5 hours. I think the last voter was able to cast their ballot at 1:30 in the morning. 1:30. And so it's incumbent upon our leadership, our legislative leadership, our executive state leadership, and our organizational leadership to come together and work on these common solutions, because it is not a political question. It's a question of democracy. It's a question of humanity. And it's a question of doing just simply what's right.
Reverend James, Major of Woodall. Reverend, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.